I call Jenny Solisa.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, for this opportunity to contribute to budget of 2016. Mr Speaker, you may recall that in my maiden speech I pledged to bring the voices of the people of Manukau East into our nation's conversation. I came to Parliament wanting to do my best to ensure our government is one that works for everyone, including my constituents in South Auckland, as well as ordinary New Zealanders, those who are hardworking, people who work 2 full-time jobs and some who work a full-time job and an additional part-time job. But, Mr Speaker, they still just can't make ends meet. Mr Speaker, over a week before this budget announcement, there were a lot of discussions about working families living in cars, working families living in garages, and homelessness in New Zealand in general. And, Mr Speaker, I was very hopeful that Budget 2016 would actually address those folks living in cars and families living in garages, Mr Speaker. But I was bitterly disappointed because Budget 2016 does not provide relief for those families. Budget 2016 did not provide long-term solutions to comprehensively address homelessness or the housing crisis. Mr Speaker, this budget did not deliver comprehensive solutions for homelessness or indeed for the housing crisis. This budget was a great opportunity for the government to show leadership in the area of housing, and they did not. In Auckland, where the average price of a house is over $950,000 today, most families, Mr Speaker, that come to my office in Otara seeking advice, they don't come asking for assistance to purchase just under $1 million worth of a house. Unfortunately, many of my constituents come to seek assistance because they can no longer afford to pay the high, unaffordable weekly rent. Many of these working families have been pushed out of the housing market, Mr Speaker, and unfortunately they are now living in cars or in garages or in other such places in the freezing cold winter in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Low-income families, Mr Speaker, are disproportionately affected when weekly rents continue to rise, and they have no control over the kinds of rents that landlords charge. Just last week, the University of Otago released a study where they told us that there are over 40,000 people who are now homeless. When comparing the census figures of 2013 with the census figures of 2006 and 2001, it is a staggering number to hear that we now have over 40,000 people who are homeless in New Zealand. But, Mr Speaker, New Zealand is a country where we have a safety net. We are supposed to have a safety net for our most vulnerable children, for our elderly who are now also living in cars and garages. Mr Speaker, this safety net under this current government has a big hole, and the national government is not ensuring that that hole is patched up. The level of home ownership is the lowest that it's ever been in 65 years. Now, what does this Budget 2016 propose to address homelessness or indeed for state housing? Well, the national government announced $41 million for homelessness. When it was first announced by the minister, though, in this House, she said that that $41 million were for 3,000 new places. But we know, Mr Speaker, that the minister had to come back to the House.
Members carrying a conversation would be better off sitting alongside one another.
We know, Mr Speaker, thank you, Mr Speaker. We know, Mr Speaker, that this minister had to come back to this House and correct her statement because it turned out that these places weren't new places after all. This is the government of smoke and mirrors, and this is the government that when families are homeless and when we don't have enough emergency housing, this is a government actually would recommend for those particular families to go and live in motels, except they would have to pay back the $1,200 per week or the $1,300 per week for having lived in that motel. So let's see, what other solutions has this national government come up with to address the housing crisis and homelessness? Well, they've passed legislation to sell off thousands of our state houses, and in this budget, they've put aside $7.5 million to sell off our state houses. This is the government who promised us that they will not sell off any more of our assets. The last time I looked, Mr. Speaker, I think we can actually say that our state houses, our social housing, are indeed one of our biggest assets that taxpayers own in this country. Yet another broken promise from this government. And instead of ensuring that our homeless families are housed, that our vulnerable children and our elderly folks who are living in cars and garages are indeed housed, instead of actually housing themselves in a car or in a garage, what does this current government do? Well, their solution is to sell off the state houses, precisely at the time when we're experiencing a housing crisis, when rent is becoming so unaffordable, Mr. Speaker, and when first home-time buyers are actually finding it really hard just to get their foot in the door. This national government has sold off nearly 3,000 of our state houses since 2011, and at the same time we're seeing nearly 5,000 people across New Zealand who are on the waiting list for a state house. These people, Mr. Speaker, I contend, should indeed be housed. What else do we see in this national budget of 2016? Well, we see social investment approach. Apparently, it is to target money to the most at-risk kids. But apparently, housing our most at-risk vulnerable kids is not part of this investment approach. Having a house is a basic human need. Our kids, indeed, especially our vulnerable children, should be housed. But you know, Mr. Speaker, I'm really heartened that we actually have people in Aotearoa, New Zealand, who get it. We have people who actually care and who actually are addressing homelessness on a practical level. And I'd like to acknowledge and thank Te Puia Marae and Mangere for opening up their doors to homeless people in Mangere and saying, we are here to assist you, we are here to care for you. Indeed, you're right, Ruth, it is indeed the government's job, I would have thought, to say we are here to care for you. Another organisation, the Salvation Army, they've done this work for many, many years. Another organisation, another NGO, Monte Cecilia, who house our vulnerable families again in Mangere. And the City Mission, Mr. Speaker, they have indeed served our homeless families for many, many years. And recently, I've also had Samoan churches and Tongan churches reach out to me from my electorate saying that they also would like to assist to feed our homeless people. But it's more than that, Mr. Speaker. I'm heartened because I've also had individuals reach out to me saying that they have spare bedrooms in their homes, saying that they have a spare room in an office, and even saying that they have land that they can, if people would like to come and park their caravan on their land, that people can also do that. And just today, Mr. Speaker, I've even had a builder and his wife coming to me saying that they can also come and put insulation in a garage and put carpet down so that a family can be warm. Mr. Speaker, I'm really heartened that we have caring people in New Zealand that step up where the government should be stepping up to care for our vulnerable families. 2 days ago in Auckland, Mr. Speaker, the outside temperature went down as low as 4 degrees. I can only imagine what it would be like, what it would feel like if you actually lived in a car or if you actually lived in a garage to then also live in such a cold 4 degrees type place. Mr. Speaker, my challenge to everyone in this House, but especially those on the opposite side, come out on June the 16th. We have Park for Homes in Mangere. For those members of Parliament, especially on the opposite side of the House, that do not know what it's like but would like, are curious to know what it's like to live in a car, come out and experience it at least for one night. Maybe then you might care a little bit more for homeless families living in cars. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
I call